Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Robinson. I'm a partner at a company called Mazarine Ventures. We are early stage technology investors, entirely focused on innovations that address some aspect of water or wastewater. When we look at investment opportunities, we're looking through the lens of quality and we're looking through the lens of quantity. Both are big challenges and both present risks to agriculture, business, cities, and utilities. So the purpose of today's discussion is to talk about remote sensing, the category of remote sensing, and how new tools in remote sensing are enabling society and industry to better manage water risk, whether quality or quantity. The specific topic of conversation is how satellite sourced data is being utilized to provide even higher resolution insights into water quality and quantity risk. So today's format is conversational. There's no PowerPoints, no presentations. I'm the moderator, and I'm fortunate to be joined by some friends, and we're just gonna have a conversation, and you all are eavesdropping in on our conversation. So I'll start with Sucharita, if you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, John. I'm Sucharita Dasa from Barclays, and I'm responsible for leading the water coverage, and I sit within our sustainable and impact banking team, which is a fairly, I should say, the first of its kind or the only kind in a large investment bank, where we focus on mission-focused companies that make a positive impact on climate. So water comes within part of it. And as John mentioned, remote monitoring is really important for us and also for our clients. And this is where the future is, and this has accelerated a lot more given COVID. And we're always interested in new technologies in remote monitoring. And we really appreciate John for letting us host this. And we really like working with Mazarine because they keep us very close to the ground on trends in water. So good to look forward to the discussion, and good to meet everybody.
Thanks, Sucharita. Yeah, I think this is our third or fourth event that we partnered on, and it's always stimulating conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. Greetings from Westchester, New York, about 20 miles north of the city. Daniel Baruch. I'm the Director of Global Energy Markets and Business Development at URSA. My background is mostly across commodities trading, both physical and financial, some alternative investment experience in the financial service sector. And for folks who are unfamiliar with URSA, we're essentially a satellite radar-based intelligence company, both with clients on the business and government side. Ultimately, our expertise is on synthetic aperture radar, also known as SAR, which some folks on the call I'm sure are familiar with. Admittedly, my background is purely market-based and non-technical, so my comments will not be technical in nature, but we've done quite a bit in different markets, energy, macroeconomic, water in particular, we'll touch on later in the conversation, but predominantly focused on how synthetic aperture radar-based satellites can provide that sort of reliability and that timely pulse on kind of inflection points in how markets are moving.
Cool, thanks, Daniel. Ivan?
Sure.
Hey, thanks, John. My name is Ivan Lalovich. I'm the founder and CEO of Jibe. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, although our team is fully distributed nowadays, spanning 3 continents at the moment. My background's actually in technology. I spent close to 17, 18 years in the semiconductor industry, driving innovation in microprocessors, memories, communication devices. Jibe is essentially trying to scale up monitoring of watersheds for our customers. So we're monitoring water quality and quantity using distributed or fusion of distributed sensing from remote imagers, satellite aerial platforms, and we also have some hardware that we've developed that gets added to the mix to provide data across different spatial, temporal, and parameter domains. So tools for the job. Happy to dive into that more going forward in this conversation. But yeah, really my honor to be a part of this conversation to talk about what our clients do.
Thanks, Ivan. Tyler? And it's just to say, I should apologize, Tyler. Tyler's one of our organizers, and in my gallery here, he was later in the gallery. But thanks to RTI for being part of this event, Tyler.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here. So I'm coming to you guys from North Carolina, where I work at RTI Innovation Advisors. We're a mission-driven innovation consultancy. So we don't provide satellite remote sensing data or analytics, but we do help our clients, corporate sustainability groups or private foundations or those in the federal government, think about how remote sensing and other technology is going to impact their planning moving forward. And so my focus in our portfolio has been primarily on water and sanitation and on remote sensing, but there hasn't been a lot of overlap. But excited to talk more about this area because I think that will change going forward. And I have a particular lean in the satellite remote sensing world towards SAR technology. So same as Daniel, and particularly interferometric SAR. So we're really interested in how that can help monitor distributed infrastructure related to water utilities or dams or water in the oil and gas pipeline space. I think there are some interesting opportunities in water quantity to do with INSAR as well that I hope we can get into later. But really a broad topic, and happy to be here to have this conversation with you all.
Great, thanks, Tyler. Sean? You're on mute, Sean.
Sorry, I've got it. Well, thanks, John, for inviting me. Happy to be part of the conversation. My name is Sean Donegan. My background is, this is my 4th software company that I've started and owned along the way. And we are in the geospatial analytics world. 6 main markets, started with life in water, wastewater, power, pipeline, oil and gas, mining, and rail. And we use predominantly satellite data, but of course we're agnostic to the source, based on machine learning. And our critical element is to get out ahead and minimize any of the events that might cause challenges, either regulatory, environmental, or from loss of revenue. So minimizing consequence, and from the point of capture to the client being alerted, generally a couple of hours. So I think we've perfected some of the conversations that have been going on around here already in the introduction. Happy to be a part of this.
Thanks,
Based
Sean.
in Toledo, Ohio, sorry, 751st most visited city in the nation.
751st. Where is that? Where did you source that data? Is there like a list?
Well, we're trying for 749, so the Chamber of Commerce has given me a free t-shirt to anybody that visits, so we'd like you to come and visit.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sean.
You're welcome.
Caleb?
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and thanks everybody for being on the panel. So my name's Caleb White. I'm up here in Ottawa, Canada, so not the Great White North yet, but soon to be. So my background is kind of a mix of business and technology. I'm not a technologist, but I do know a fair bit about it. The last 5 or 6 years spent mostly in data. The last 2 years in remote sensing data. So been working with a number of different companies under our portfolio company Habitat One, and some of them, as Jason had explained at the top of the clock, have to do with kind of the sustainability and planetary change perspective and how that impacting businesses both in the private and public sector. So I kind of focus these days on how do we get the infrastructure, all of this data wrangling into delivering insights to clients. And the other core piece of our work is working with the scientific community and enabling the insights coming out of that group to try to understand what's happening from a planetary change perspective and delivering those insights into organizational systems.
Cool. Thanks, Caleb. Let's stick with you, and maybe you could share with us a little bit about OpenET. I know it still is a little bit under the radar, but maybe you could just provide a quick overview of what is OpenET and who's involved in it. It's kind of exciting.
Yeah, thanks. So one of our sub companies is called Habitat 7. I've been working for about 2 or 3 years on a project called OpenET. You can go to openetdata.org and check it out. It's going to be launching next year formally. I can't say that I speak for OpenET. That would be misrepresenting. But the firm that I work with, Habitat 7, has been involved in basically designing and delivering the systems that take the data from the scientific community, creating the pipelines, and then creating the actual interface and visualization for obtaining that data. OpenET is a collaboration among a number of partners, including NASA, DRI, Environmental Defense Fund, Google Earth Engine. What the purpose is to come together to use remote sensing data to measure evapotranspiration. And for those that don't know what evapotranspiration is, it's basically how much water the Earth is transpiring, both through evaporation as well as transpiration through plants. Some significant implications to what that means and the ability to do that at scale, which I'm happy to chat about. But it's the first of its kind. It's going to be released next year, probably in Q1, Q2, and really exciting project.
And it's going to be available for free to anybody who wants to access the data, correct?
Correct. I think the project team is still talking through what will be free and what will not be, or what will be for charge and what will not, what will be for free. The interface for sure for consumption through that will be free, but there's also a sustainability effort from a financial perspective to ensure that that the lights stay on and that sort of thing, and the science can keep happening.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Tyler. We're going to move around between different people. I do have a follow-up question on that one, but I want to move back to Tyler. Tyler, you mentioned INSAR, people have mentioned SAR, there's of course optical. Maybe you could just provide everyone on the call with a quick summary of because not everybody is in the space. Could you provide just a quick overview of what are the different options in terms of remote sensing from satellites?
Sure, I can provide that overview, but I might take a stab first at talking only about synthetic aperture radar or SAR satellites. So SAR, it can be a satellite system, it could be flown as well. And I know that we have kind of a mix here of technical backgrounds, but essentially SAR is not an optical satellite. It's providing its own energy source, and it's interpreting what comes back to the satellite to give you insight into change detection on the ground, and then to also help you in some applications determine the surface material properties. So it can be used in a range of applications. I think Daniel could go on about the different financial sector applications, but my work is really focused in on the INSAR application, which is where you look at the change in height between measurements, and that can be used to monitor critical infrastructure, like in the oil and gas sector, to detect pipeline leaks after they happen, or to hopefully prevent them. It can be used to monitor mines and dams that are operational. It can also be used for the construction industry, and through them, the insurance sector, to monitor construction projects like urban tunneling projects that are particularly problematic and hard to measure the impact of if you've got to put sensors on the ground everywhere. So I think when I think about SAR, it's this data source that works through weather, can work day and night, and lets us quantify things. I think especially with some of the new commercial providers and some of the space agency assets that are coming out, lets us quantify things that were previously very hard to quantify. And I think there are early adopters in that sector where the payer for the data is particularly well capitalized today already. I'm really curious to see what applications can develop as these new, better, and free data sets are available. What applications can be developed around those that, with data processing innovations, can really be accessible to different use cases that might have a different ability to pay, like in the utility sector or elsewhere. So I think that's a really interesting piece to monitor moving forward.
Thanks, Tyler. I want to come to Yvonne and then Sean about optical sensing. There's obviously people have been taking pictures of the Earth for 30, 40 years. Tell me, Yvonne, a little bit, and then Sean, about the utilization of optical sensing and the value and how you think of that.
Yeah, so there's been a range of applications when we realized that pointing optical sensors to Earth is a useful thing that have come out of that, primarily in the scientific community, to understand global cycles of a variety of things, understanding vegetation, understanding weather. So it's huge kind of application space from observation of Earth, understanding kind of how what are places in the universe, and what the matter is that covers the Earth. So the typical kind of space that people have used optical for is to understand the surface. Obviously, things are not very optically transparent if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum outside of the optical domain. What JIBE does is specifically take a look at the interactions between material and light in water. So we look at how photons that come from the sun interact with the substance that's either dissolved or suspended or present on the surface of the water, and deduce based on that optical signal what is causing it and how concentrated it is. So we can determine concentrations of different constituents in water that are quite relevant to a host of ecological assessments or monitoring needs for customers.
So Yvonne, you have a big focus on water quality risks, correct?
Correct, yeah. So we're solving this pretty challenging issue of trying to detect, again, what the concentrations are of constituents, pollutants in watersheds, and help our customers see which kinds of activities that they undertake that are being most effective to drive change in the positive direction.
Okay, that's helpful. And Sean, how are you using optical sensing at Satellytics?
So we started life looking at water, wastewater. Lake Erie, as many will know already, shut down its water supply in places like Toledo in 2014, 15, and 13 and 14. And our first three algorithms were, so the remote sensing in our world is, or geospatial analytics as is more fashionably called, it uses the power of the sun, the light reflecting off the surface or water is then that light is captured, or those reflectance signatures are captured by the sensor, typically on a satellite, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a drone, a plane, a fixed camera, or all of the above. And practically speaking, satellites get us the data back quicker than any of the other platforms because you're dealing about terabytes of data. And it's our unique capability in our software to identify those constituents and then probably, I think, without being too conceited about it, what sets us aside, because we hold some patents in this area, we also quantify. So for phosphorus, phycosan, and chlorophyll A, the three constituents that make up algae blooms, we measure them in parts per billion. And we parlayed that into oil and gas for heavy metal concentrations like arsenic, barium, iron, manganese, and copper, subaquatic vegetation like hydrilla, total suspended solids. So the application and our goal is that we keep developing these real challenging solutions to some of our customers' problems in a bucket of algorithms that can all be run at the same time against the same set of data. So when you walk into an organization that may deal in produced water, which is salinity, most of you may know that's a real pain and challenge to eliminate, then you're helping several different business fronts. So if they spend $1,000, you're dividing it by 10 rather than each individual problem spending $1,000 and driving no efficiencies at all. So our use of the algorithms have been always in the commercial space. We don't do any work for any regulators because, when we're dealing with the customers we're dealing with, we want them to trust us, not to believe that we're playing both sides of the fence.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sean. I'll get back to you with a follow-up question on that. Daniel, share us a little bit about some of you've worked with government a little bit, haven't you? Share us a little bit of some of the use cases that have been on your desk recently.
Sure. The only thing I would add just to Tyler's comments, I think he did a great job of touching on SAR. The beauty of SAR, just before kind of jumping into these use cases, is the fact that you get this transparency without having to deal with potentially weather-related disruptions. So, for example, looking at activity at a port in China, let's say, it could be notoriously cloudy for 6 weeks straight, for example. As Tyler mentioned, you're able to get that actual measurement and that actual indication of activity by penetrating through the clouds. And essentially that's what we've tried to leverage through other use cases, in particular with ESG or some of the more, as you mentioned, government sort of humanitarian efforts, looking at oil spills or water supply in certain areas of the world. With regard to ESG, there was a particular use case a few years ago. Folks might be familiar with some of the tragic mining collapses in Brazil, which caused quite a bit of death and environmental destruction. Essentially the tailings dam that was holding back some polluted mining water ended up overflowing, and some of the byproducts were ultimately thrown throughout the estuaries, as well as impacted some of the vegetation for upwards of a year plus in the area. So these are areas that SAR is able to actually determine different levels of water. Again, that could be used for various dam reservoir analysis. There's some pretty interesting developments in Ethiopia right now. Folks might be following the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which kind of has been a flashpoint for Ethiopia and its downstream neighbors, Sudan and Egypt as well. Just the overall conflict around sustainability of water supply has been an issue. So understanding what levels are these reservoirs in essentially real time has been prudent and quite valuable. In Iraq, another case, we were working with some government counterparts where essentially almost all of Iraq's water supply comes from two main rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, as folks might know. But essentially understanding in real time what the level of water is in those particular supply zones could be a precursor for issues of water supply conflict. And that can actually be a flashpoint for potential state fragility or chaos in the larger state or regional stability in that sense. And more recently, unfortunately, there was an instance with the VM Wakashia, which was a bulk oil carrier a few weeks ago that ended up running aground off the coast of Mauritius, actually the coast of Africa. And we actually blended different data sets, AIS, which is a sort of a ship tracking capability, with SAR, and that analysis ultimately showed where the oil slick was spreading, which helped sort of the humanitarian and recovery efforts as well to kind of help guide where the recovery efforts and those operations should go to kind of streamline and maximize or optimize that intel for the recovery efforts. So between sort of the ESG more on the sort of financial component, as well as oil spills and overall water level detection on a global basis or kind of micro basis, have been some of the main areas we've been focusing on as of late.
Hey, those sound like really meaningful applications where you're saving lives and saving wildlife as well. Ivan, I want to come back to you for a second about Jibe's offerings. How are your insights changing behavior amongst your customers? It seems like you operate more in the conservation world. I'm curious to know what value you're creating and how that plays out with your customers.
Yeah, thanks, John. So we've got a pretty broad set of customers at the moment. We started the company just 16 months ago. We do have quite a bit of work with the Nature Conservancy, who backed Jibe through an accelerator with Techstars. Obviously, the conservation organizations need to show quantifiable outcomes from conservation work, not just how many shovels were dug and where, or how many trees were planted. So really, that's where Jibe comes into play, providing both the kind of during project monitoring, understanding the baseline. Satellite data provides you the ability to extract or extend the baseline understanding of what was there as far as the archive of data is available. So we can look back in time, compare that baseline to trends during project and after project. And that's really been the effort. We've focused quite a bit on the Mississippi Basin. There's a pretty significant runoff challenge with regards to nitrates and fertilizers that end up causing a very significant issue in the Gulf of Mexico. So trying to relate some of the pigments that are visible in the Mississippi to nitrate flows, and eventually try to scale that up to providing nitrate maps and dynamics over the entire basin. So that's just work with the Nature Conservancy with regards to a specific project that impacts half the country and the largest watershed in the United States. But we're also working with utilities like drinking water utilities, which do source water protection, giving them a real-time feedback. So some of the challenges that were brought up earlier in terms of obscuration due to clouds or smoke in the West, as we've seen recently, that to challenge optical instruments that are at high altitude. We overcome that with providing local, real-time, low latency sensing that we use both to refine the algorithms, but also provide data when this cloud cover occurs. So that's really important for utilities, which need to have kind of immediate low latency data from surface water reservoirs where they.
So Ivan, what sensors you're putting these around a source water? You're putting a sensor on the ground, or on a tower, on a pole on the ground. Elaborate on that a little bit. What is so that's to help for ground truthing, and then if there is cloud cover, it provides another sensing tool.
Yeah, correct. We kind of use it for a number of things. It's a very similar. It's a remote sensing instrument, so we are not in contact with water. Looking again at the light matter interaction, and from that solving this inverse problem of what's causing that signal. We use it both to refine the satellite. So one of the biggest challenges for optical measurements to get the reflectances or the radiances correct, you need to remove the atmospheric signal. The atmosphere provides quite a bit of the signal that's there, and if you don't do that correctly, then you can have significant challenges with regards to robustness of your retrievals. And so we overcome that with the ground stations that are deployed across the watershed, and obviously some IP on how to do that effectively throughout seasons and for a range of conditions where there's lots of other things that happen, tree cover, canopy, etc., and geography that's present there. It all contributes to the signals that you get from the surface of a water body. Right, got it.
So one more question for our featured participants, for Caleb, and then we're going to get to open discussion. Caleb on mute. Caleb, what is the Open ET? Seems like a really high profile undertaking with a lot of big players involved. Could you just share with everyone again what the mission and vision is for this, and what is the intended value for? Is it just North America, or is it US, or the world, or elaborate a little bit?
Yeah. So far, just the Western U.S. I think there's 17 states that are included in the initial launch. Ultimately, it comes down to water management. There's been previously no way to understand how much water is being used at scale, and measuring ET from space using remote sensing data allows the scale and frequency that's required in order to, basically manage water and all the assets that it includes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So now they're about halfway through this discussion. I want to just kind of open it up to some general questions. And I want to just start with Tyler, just with a very high level question. Now that we know who everybody is on this call and what you do and your organization, Tyler, what are some of the headwinds and the tailwinds behind using satellite data to inform water risk management? I'm curious about headwinds and tailwinds from your perspective.
I think the big headwind from my perspective kind of comes back to something Daniel mentioned. He kept using the word flashpoint, and I think that's critical when we think about this, because the repeat rates of satellites that are going up now and the data latency is getting much better than it's been. I think some folks that might know the satellite remote sensing space, without thinking about the increasing repeat rates and the reduced latency, might say like, okay, this is kind of steady state. This is where we've been. But I think that's the big, from my point of view, that's the big tailwind. I might have said it reversed a moment ago, but I think that's the big tailwind, because it's going to enable these more operational use cases for satellite remote sensing data, whereas before they might not have been able to, you might have needed ground truth data for your use case. So I think that's big. And I think that there's this, somebody mentioned for SAR, at least, there's terabytes of data coming in. So I think another big tailwind are these machine learning and other approaches for dealing with this huge amount of data. I think that kind of cloud processing from the space agency side, enabling people to do some of the processing before they are kind of consuming the data into their internal processes, could be really valuable moving forward. But I think that's the tailwind, because people are getting better. And I think that's also a potential headwind if we do see some interesting use cases, reach bottlenecks where they say, if you really want operational data across all of your different distributed assets, you might run up against challenges in processing all that data, because there's it's such a rich data source now.
Mm-hmm. And Sean, circling back to you, Sean, what are some of the challenges that you think this realm faces going forward? Obviously, Satellytics, you've had a lot of success in the last few years, but where do you see some of the headwinds for this space?
Well, I think the biggest headwind is the cost of the data. Almost 90% of everything that we are challenged with, we're tasking the satellites. So we're pointing them over an area on a frequency that meets the customer's challenge. I think the biggest heavy lift, the most expensive ingredient in the mixing bowl is the cost of the data. People talk here about cloud impediments. That's not so problematic. I mean, we've been collecting data over North Dakota, which is not the most forgiving community, for the last 3 years every single week. But I think in order for this area of analytics, at the heart of which we have is neural networks, and they're learning all the time. So it's not about accuracy, it's not about false positives, which may have been in the past. What it's really about now is how do you, like Jeffrey Moore says in his book about crossing the chasm, you've got early adopters, you've got visionaries. Now, how do you make it ubiquitous? And I still believe our strongest objection today comes around cost. Of course, as I was once told by one wise owl in oil and gas, the further we're away from an event, the fuzzier our minds become. So there's nothing like, whether it's human disaster, environmental disaster, that brings people back to the table with a rather rapid abandon to say, now, how much was that, when they consider what the alternatives are. But cost is the biggest ingredient, the heaviest lift.
Thanks, Sean. That's informative. Yvonne, I want to come back to you again. From your perspective, from Jibe's perspective, some water bodies or some watersheds would probably be more open to this type of support. What have you found in terms of fit with certain customers and the pushback? Because seems like some of Jibe's capabilities might not resonate with certain types of customers. I'm curious about what feedback you've seen from the market.
Yeah, I mean, we've done actually very little active selling to customers. Most of our pipeline to date has been inbound, and it's really been driven and centered around the cost and the complexity to set up a monitoring system. It takes a long time. It typically requires multiple either consultancies or universities to get involved to start collecting water samples or to deploy instruments to a site where you're doing work or you're interested to find out more.
So let me jump right there. So you're competing against incumbent engineering consultancies that are doing things the old-fashioned way, right?
Yeah. So what we're seeing is this extreme cost and difficulty in setting up and getting these monitoring programs off the ground. The challenges are increasing. There's a higher need for data and more monitoring, but it's really hard to scale that up, especially during times of COVID. Whether you have the most well-intentioned monitoring plans are very difficult to execute in times of weather events. You can't send your crews out to sample when it's actually potentially the most interesting to get these kind of water samples obtained. So those are some of the benefits that we see. So our ability to deploy a network which is autonomous, runs continuously, doesn't require people to go out and collect water samples, and then the scalability of satellite-based kind of orders of magnitudes of data volume that comes from that in the spatial domain in particular is a really appealing combination to our customers.
So, Daniel, I want to come back to you for a second. What's a use case that you're eyeing that you haven't done any work in yet relating to water that you think that URSA could lend a hand?
There's a couple that we're exploring in the early stages. I mean, illegal fishing has been one where multiple folks have reached out. This is essentially any country with a coastline tends to suffer from illegal fishing and could have large economic impacts. The ag space, I think, is one that has already been quite saturated in that sense. But looking at sort of global water level monitoring at essentially a global scale to understand sort of the climate impacts has both commercial and government interest in that sense between the financial institutions, insurance sector, folks on the real estate side, where they should actually develop or where there may be risk in terms of risk management or actuarial services, having more kind of robust modeling capabilities that go under those underlying assumptions. I'd say those are some of the biggest areas that we've received incoming interest that both tends to straddle commercial and government. As of late, we've been doing some additional expansion in sort of the flood monitoring space. As the U.S. Gulf Coast has been barraged this hurricane season, the folks are trying to understand, again, from both government and commercial perspective, what's been the impact. There's been some mega refineries in the U.S. Gulf Coast that have been impacted and come offline. What does that mean for production of various grades of gasoline and the overall demand for those products? So again, that can typically straddle both the commercial and government sectors as well.
Mm-hmm. Tyler, I want to come back to you for a second because I know you've been thinking about humanitarian and developing countries around the world that are hard to reach. What is your view on using satellite source data to provide more visibility into problems on the other side of the world?
Sure. Yeah, I think a lot of my work in the water and sanitation space, which I mentioned earlier, and it's not historically been related to remote sensing, has been in low and middle income countries for private foundations or companies looking to develop products for those markets. And the sanitation world might not be one that you think about often, but there are still 4 billion people without basic sanitation services. So the impact there on the watersheds, even there's untreated wastewater and fecal sludge. There's also partially treated wastewater that's making it to plants. I think that priorities on the ground there for municipalities is provide those basic services, but I think remote sensing can play an interesting role there because I don't think that it's going to see this kind of at least the same level of incumbent traditional monitoring for things like water quality. I think that there's an opportunity to achieve scale there from a data point of view, where if these maybe freely or more affordable data sets can be sourced globally, that's kind of a white space to grow into where there's less incumbent on the ground solutions. I think a couple barriers there is ability to pay has been the reason that it's hard to overcome these challenges historically. So I think there's a real business model question. I think it might be reliant on some of the free, maybe agency or other free data sets to kind of provide value there in a way that utilities can afford. And then I think also, it's significant disaggregation of the market there. The customer acquisition cost could be pretty high. But I think those are historical problems in that remote sensing, satellite remote sensing, and the infrastructure related to processing it is kind of reaching a point where those problems might be worth spending time on trying to crack.
Interesting. Sucharita, do you have any observations on any of this?
Yeah, I mean, really, really good, interesting conversation. So given we spent so much time on this remote monitoring topic, and it's really interesting to see how satellite plays a role. Question that I have, I know a lot of you mentioned, their alternative, what the alternatives are. It's all this manual that people do. So what is the infrastructure that you need on the ground for this, for a company or one of your customers to utilize satellite monitoring? Do you need to have infrastructure, or is that it's not something that you require, or is it based on application?
Sean, you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, sure. First of all, you really don't need anything on the ground. That's the beauty of it, because what you're trying to do is to eliminate, in many or in all of our cases here, whether government, humanitarian, or business, you're trying to eliminate the need to put people in harm's way. I mean, that's one of the overarching goals. Certainly the industry infrastructure we deal with, it's in some of the most challenging places on Mother Earth. So you don't need any infrastructure. When you develop these algorithms, and that's done in a number of ways, both from a scientific lab perspective and then from a ground truthing perspective, particularly when you want to quantify, you do some ground truthing. And that may be alongside of a customer, or, because we live on the edge of Lake Erie, we can rent a boat if we're dealing with water-based algorithms that we want to quantify. So that's sort of some of that. But that may be a 3 to 4 month process. We monitor and measure methane. So that was a much more challenging quantification process. But if I may, Tyler made a comment about some of the poorer areas in the world, and I think it overarches what you just said. Our largest customer is BP, and what we're very fortunate enough to be able to do is we've had great success with them, but part of their give back to some of these less developed countries is now they're using satellites to help them with some of these humanitarian issues. So what is the water quality? Where's the water quality? Where's the fragility in forestry, deforestation, tree speciation? So we are pushing an awful lot of that back. And we experimented with this in North Dakota, and the state was incredibly receptive. And it was on more about the agricultural community, bridge repair, road repair, tree speciation, land movement, but parlaying what we already have as a bucket of algorithms into some of the less developed countries is, I mean, it's just, we're just running other data. It just happens to be in other parts of the world. And the great thing about that, back to your point about where you need to be, you know, that data is provided to these essential services and people that make decisions in these far-flung places, literally from the cloud. So it's not as if, again, there's a large commitment to infrastructure. There's basically a smartphone, a tablet, or a browser, nothing to install, and you've got the access you need. So that's how I see it, but most definitely don't need to put people in harm's way.
Yeah, so got it. So that one I think is the key value proposition, seems like for customers.
Yeah, for sure.
Got it.
I want to circle back to Caleb really quickly about Open ET and about the process, sort of the genesis of this. What was the original problem that you set out to solve? I mean, going back a couple of years, I imagine this project's been around for a while. Who got together and decided this was a priority?
So that would be the original founding organizations, NASA, Environmental Defense Fund, DRI, and Google themselves. You know, I think that there was a need for a way to do it in an agreed upon manner. So OpenET, you know, to your point, Shira, you also need to step back a little bit in certain cases, which is, there's a lot of uncharted territory still, I think, from a remote sensing perspective, especially when you look at the analytics side. There's a lot of stuff that I think is kind of out of the box these days, but when you're looking at net new scientific problems or net new insights, it does take a little bit of a big lift to get the science community agreeing on what is actually the right number. And I think that was one of the premises of OpenET is, could we get agreement in academia and around the table on what is that number? And so OpenET is based on a combination of 6 models that measure evapotranspiration. And they've been doing a intercomparison study over the last couple of years to assess those, including ground truth data, to come out at an answer of like, can we scientifically justify that this is the number to a certain level of error? And they've been able to do that. So I think in certain cases, it could be a very quick process to understanding that end ultimate analytic and what that end result is. And most importantly, how much do we trust it? And not only from an organization perspective, like the public sector or the private sector, but when you start looking at policy implications and, you know, our elected officials writing policy around certain data sets and certain insights, that's where it becomes critically important to have defensible information in an agreed upon manner in which you've arrived at that number. So I think that's kind of the premise of OpenET, is to bring the smartest organizations around the table, develop and do the hard work it takes to come up with that answer, and have the proof and the justification to say, yes, that is the agreed upon number. Let's move forward and let the society at large flourish, because there's a number of different use cases around it. When you look at water management, it's not just about identifying how much water was used, but it's water reporting, it's water trading, it can be incentive-driven conservation practices, watershed management. There's a whole host of additional societal things that get kicked off after you know how much water is being used. And also it's stretching into, I mean, not yet with OpenET, but that we do know of cases where there have been legal cases around defending whether water was used or whether a land was irrigated. So this is where the premise of having this one common number or one common approach to identifying what is that true number becomes critical. And I think the premise of OpenET.
Thanks, Caleb. Ivan, you mentioned helping utilities manage source water risk. Have you gone beyond that with utilities? I know there's other people out there looking for leak detection in pipes, or maybe anybody who wants to chime in on this. I mean, you can't get far in water risk without sooner or later bumping into utilities. One use case was obviously source water monitoring. Ivan, for you or anybody, in terms of working with utilities and their needs, Sean, have you ever come across any utility customers and helping them with water?
We have a large number of utility customers. We often partner with Black & Veatch on this very topic. The challenge, frankly, has been one around the willingness of utilities to fund and use these types of technologies and projects. You know, when you're speaking to Saudi Arabia about water leakage, it's the equivalent of speaking to America about an oil leakage. So water to them is more precious, so there's more likelihood of them engaging in a project to do leak detection. We have not found the same demand in water utilities. Of course, we also happen to live in an area where algae blooms is one of the challenges, but lack of water is not. I think, isn't it the average about 23% of all water is lost in the United States each year through aging infrastructure? Yeah, it's an interesting area. Nobody really sees it as a high priority from our perspective, and therefore it hasn't risen to the top. Other water challenges have subaquatic vegetation, sediment, other things that we deal with on a daily basis, but not water leaks per se.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Daniel, what about you? What do you see as a possible opportunity with utilities?
So we personally haven't done very much with the utility sector, but in particular, kind of around optimization of assets is one area that we have received some initial interest in terms of understanding, in particular the Pacific Northwest, for example, understanding sort of snow melt and how that can impact some of the hydro generation facilities. So essentially kind of optimization around assets at the end of the day from a utility perspective.
Mm-hmm. And Ivan, going forward on the quality side, take us forward a few years with Jive. What are sort of your ideal projects over the next 5 years? What would you like to be working on? I'm gonna unmute him.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, so on the utility side, I mean, the recent fires or the current fires that are still ongoing in the western part of the U.S. And wildfires in general are a big have a big interplay with water and water quality, in particular for some of the surface water municipals that draw from it. It's a significant and increasing concern, I think, and the types of pollutants that end up in the waterways are more and more difficult to understand, because of the density and the interaction between man-made structures that burn down. The impacts are significant, and a lot of the utilities that are in the space of that draw water from reservoirs spend significant amount of money on protection, which means essentially land management, and that land management is very expensive. And understanding which kinds of land management practices are the most effective really pays off. I think much more so than any kind of policy or regulatory things. It's really understanding operationally where the money is being spent and how effective is it in mitigating both fire risk, but more directly water quality challenges. So we're focused on utilities. We're also focused on the private sector. There's a number of verticals in the consumer packaged goods space that are very advanced in looking at sustainable supply chain for them, both in terms of the agriculture, but as well as packaging materials that go in. We're working with Anheuser-Busch InBev, the largest beer brewer in the world, who's very, very focused on making sure that their supply risk is understood in and around water, and that the water that is used is converted into value for communities where they operate. So yeah, our efforts really to scale in those areas for watersheds that have multiple stakeholders that are really impaired regionally and then eventually globally.
Mm-hmm. Tyler, I want to switch it back for you for a second. Assuming that the technology on board satellites is already as good as we're going to get, let's just assume that, and the algorithms are already sophisticated enough, where's the opportunity going forward in all this? Where's the breakthrough? The hardware is great, the algorithms are great. What else? Where's the room for innovation in all this, Tyler?
Sure. So I think that the kind of the alpha that we'll see going forward, and I think those things will continue to get better, but if we say that they're not, I think the alpha will be who understands their customer the best. Because I think, you know, Sean rightly mentioned these kind of, he told a story about starting in one industry and kind of expanding it and moving up to these different use cases. But I think there are maybe with utilities on one end of the spectrum and oil and gas on the other, different abilities to pay for satellite services now. And those higher abilities to pay have helped companies develop these great algorithms and great new tools that we have today. So I think that there is time, or there is certainly space in adjacent markets to either different geographic markets or adjacent industry sectors to leverage those tools that have been developed and find new use cases. But it's really going to take engaging with users, and the people who are leading that engagement have got to understand the satellite tools available. So I hope it can be these leading companies that have this great technology, but I think there will be room for partnership for you know, folks that are not using those capabilities now to understand how they might be tweaked or just, you know, directly used for these new use cases. So I think, you know, when I think about SAR, that's often who else has distributed infrastructure, but, you know, might not have been on the leading edge of ability to pay, but would be interested in leveraging these new capabilities. And I could let someone else expand on the water quality.
Well, but I have a question for you, Tyler. So INSAR, you mentioned INSAR at the beginning of your talk. What is the I understand from INSAR that it has ability to see groundwater levels.
Yeah, so I think it has a really interesting capability to indirectly speak to groundwater levels. And so the way that works is, you know, INSAR is looking at surface deformation. So is the land going up or down, or it could be land, could be something else. But when you rapidly or over deplete a subsurface aquifer, it's been demonstrated, at least in the California use case, that you can see the land deforming above the aquifer, and then the aquifer can never, in some cases, return to holding as much water as it did before. So there's a lot of ground truthing to do here. It's different based on the different soil type, other geological features. It's not easy to do today, but I think it's a really interesting area because it's hard to measure subsurface aquifers. It takes on the ground infrastructure. So it's an indirect measurement, but you know, GRACE and GRACE follow-on data from NASA has been used to look at subsurface aquifers historically, but more like regionally. So I think that if INSAR can be developed to be useful there, it will give these water modelers who are thinking about water risk, either, you know, for their, you know, if they're a utility, but also like InBev, if they're thinking about what's the state of the subsurface aquifers, either for siting new operations or managing watersheds that they're already a part of. I think a really interesting capability that's more granular than other remote sensing assets historically. But work to be done on the science.
No, of course. And I would encourage everyone on the call to follow up with Tyler. He's got some interesting insights on the broad landscape of this. Caleb, I want to come back to you again. So if people out there are interested in partnering or being part of the OpenET, how do you suggest they work with you? I mean, they can reach out to you, but what is the engagement model?
Yeah, so go to openetdata.org. There's some emails on there to stay in touch there. I think there's a newsletter and that sort of thing. So I think the team's staying fairly tight-lipped a little bit here and there over the next quarter or two. But, you know, leading up to the launch, there'll be some more announcements coming up and some more solid plans coming out that will be released publicly. Happy to connect with myself. I mean, obviously we're part of the team, but definitely not speaking for the team. So feel free to reach out through official channels or connect with myself, and happy to get the right answers if anybody has further questions.
Thanks, Caleb. Yvonne, I want to move to you just quickly. We have a few minutes left. So there's a lot of people on this call that are in the Great Lakes region. They have abundance of water, but they have questions about quality. Yvonne, how could Great Lakes area organizations work with a company like Jibe? What is your advice to them to reach out to you, and how could you partner with them? Ivan, oh, I've got to unmute him. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, so very straightforward. I mean, we provide our services as a data service. So you pay for data that comes from satellite sources and our systems that are deployed at the ground. So we would just scope out appropriate sites, determine what's really needed for a specific use case. I mean, obviously, there's lots of efforts, interagency efforts from NOAA, EPA, and others already there. So complementing that would be of interest. But yeah, very happy to talk directly to folks that maybe have interest for specific functional type, algae functional type determination, or trying to link the toxicity levels from HABs specifically to certain pigments that may be visible.
And you could focus just on a small region, or you could focus on a whole lake. I mean, like the Great Lakes are pretty big. You could do either micro or macro, correct?
Yeah, it really depends on the dynamics, the water quality, or the hydrological dynamics that are there, the hydrodynamics, and the complexity of the water types that are coming into that lake. It really drives how many systems we would want to deploy in which locations. So obviously, the more understanding of that there is, the better we can site select those in situ sites.
Okay, thanks, Ivan. And Daniel, any final remarks about where do you see all this going? Just in a minute.
Yeah, I was going to echo some of the comments earlier in terms of headwinds and tailwinds, where, what was traditionally a headwind in terms of just partnering with industry and getting the market up the educational learning curve was traditionally a challenge. I think now it's more so, again, partnering with industry and understanding how can we give easy to use, sort of cost-effective solutions, to Sean's point, with more and more hardware being deployed in lower Earth orbit, sort of 3 to 4x over the next couple of years. On the data side, the cost side should be ultimately, from an end user perspective, being reduced, while also achieving greater sort of economies of scale and coverage of scale by having faster revisit rates, greater global coverage. So I think it's a really exciting time to be in the industry. And to the INSAR point, another interesting example there would be looking at sort of subsidence for large-scale infrastructure. This is actually something we did recently with the Three Gorges Dam in China, in particular, when there was questions about sort of infrastructure risk. Would this dam actually potentially collapse or have structural integrity issues? So the subsidence side of the coin is one I wouldn't underestimate the importance of for infrastructure investment.
Interesting. Sucharita, any final comments on all this?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one where, there are a lot of pain points in the sector where satellite remote sensing can solve. So we have a lot of interest from our clients in this, and as it evolves more, we'll start seeing a lot of investment in it and potentially M&A, because we're seeing that in traditional remote monitoring right now. So I think as this evolves and becomes a more front and center value proposition, I think we'll only start seeing more and more investment into this sector.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank our featured participants for taking the time to engage in this conversation. It's always funny in these discussions that near the end of the hour, it starts to sort of build some momentum and stuff. And the beginning is usually a little cold, but this was a great discussion. I learned a lot just by listening to you. I hope everybody who participated learned a lot. And if you have questions about getting in touch with anybody on the panel, you're welcome to email me. And otherwise, everyone have a nice weekend and take care.
Yeah, thanks everyone.